Hi, we're back at it. We left off with, we had been talking about revolutionary goals and things like attaining full employment, achieving high rates of economic growth, improving standards of living. And we got into agrarian reform, and we were talking about how the state had managed to gain control of a little less, 44%, a little less than 50% of Cuba's farmland, which they turned into state farms. And they did not distribute it to workers, whether they were workers in factories or workers on farms, because Castro believed that dividing up the land would lead to a decline in production, both in the factory and out on the field, if a bunch of people received additional land. And there was also really no resistance to this, because most workers on large estates were not small farmers who were aspiring to own land, but they just wanted job security. They just wanted better working conditions and a higher standard of living than what they previously had enjoyed under Batista. We'll see in October of 1963 that the second agrarian reform begins, and it's going to look like this. A few details for the second agrarian reform is land will be taken from farmers with over 165 acres of land. And this is because Castro wanted to reduce the strength of this landowning class, because he considered them the base of support for counter-revolutionary activity. Small landowners, another detail of the second agrarian reform, small landowners were not allowed to sell land to private landowners. And the state acquired another 19% of farmland. So in total, they're up to about a little less than 65%. They're up to 63% of having control of Cuba's farmland. And that number will continue to rise, and we'll see by the early 80s, by 1983, the state will control 80% of land. All right. As far as revolutionary economics and actual policies, from 1959 to 1960, there was this belief that socioeconomic problems could be solved rapidly and simultaneously by the power of revolutionary zeal, hard work of the leaders, improvisation, enthusiasm, and support of the people. While again it is noble, it is a bit naive after decades of essentially dictatorial control. Cuba will establish government agencies to oversee state control. And in 1960, they will nationalize major companies: textiles, oil, tobacco, banks, department stores, and transportation, as well as seize U.S. property in Cuba. Now, the United States is going to instate the trade embargo. The trade embargo is, again, in response to American businesses, American property being seized in Cuba, basically being nationalized. So when the U.S. responds with this trade embargo in February of 1960, Castro will sign an agreement with the Soviets. Actually, a Soviet delegation is going to arrive in Havana. They make an agreement that basically is for the Soviet Union to purchase Cuban sugar. In 1960, that'll be 425,000 tons. So I need to add another zero in there. 425,000 tons in 1960 and 1 million tons annually for the next 4 years. The deal will also include crude Soviet oil to Cuba. And this is going to be that oil which U.S. refineries will refuse to process. East German and Poland delegations will soon travel to Havana in March of 1960, and official Soviet-Cuban relations will reopen for the first time since 1952. And the United States, of course, is going to see this as a threat. On May 7th, the Cubans will order the American oil companies, Standard Oil, Texaco, and Shell, to refine this crude oil. And about a month later, June 7th, the companies will refuse. And by then, Cuba owed the United States, and what Cuba owed the United States was more than what the oil refineries were worth. By the end of June 1960, Castro will nationalize the refineries. Okay, fine. You don't want to refine this oil. We're basically going to remove American influence and expropriate American owners and investors, and we will nationalize the refineries. And again, as was mentioned earlier, in July of 1960, I'd mentioned this earlier, I just didn't give the month, nor did I give the president. In July of 1960, Ike will respond with implementing the trade embargo. Shortly after this, just to recap, the Soviet Union will agree to purchase what the United States would have. Then China will also agree to purchase Cuban sugar, and so by December of 1960, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc purchase the balance of Cuban sugar. And so we see by 1961, the Soviet bloc and China will absorb the majority of Cuba's sugar exports. But the problem's going to be, it's going to cause this deficit. Payments to Cuba were mostly barter. And again, this will keep Cuba from truly diversifying agriculture as planned. And we also talked about that earlier in the notes. So it was mostly they were getting repaid with other products such as weapons or oil, and they were not allowed to diversify and plant other crops such as different kinds of fruits and different kinds of vegetables or different kind of large crop produce such as corn. We're going to now just take a look at some highlights as far as revolutionary economic reform and the impact is concerned. For the 1960s, we'll see in the first couple of years, Cuba enjoyed expansion, but then will decline in growth. And this is because of the flight of technicians, heavy social expenses, defense spending, and the decision to give priority to production for internal markets, again with this reduced sugar production, which will lead to the trade deficit. Now, this would be early in the 60s because then again, the Soviet Union and China will step in where the United States had imposed this embargo. There were attempts to diversify the economy, but there's still this heavy dependence on sugar production. You know, if you do something and do something well, which sugar had always been a cash crop for Cuba. Cuba still had this dependence on sugar production and the Soviet Union itself. Industrialization will be hampered, because of poverty, because of their infrastructure, their lack of infrastructure, because of scarcity of materials and energy sources, and this impossibility of importing machinery and plants in quantities that big-scale agriculture, big-scale industrialization calls for. And again, in the 60s, we're going to hear